Okay, we are live.
Nice. So let's start.
Yeah, I'm just going to start recording and then we can begin.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Nikita Kirkise, a PhD student at the University of South Carolina and one of the co-organizers of this year's conference. So welcome to STEMPeers Global Conference 2021. The goal of this conference is to dig deeper into other interesting career options that most of us are unaware of. How do we try and identify career options that align with our interests if we don't even know what exists out there? And therefore, with the hope of helping our fellow STEMPeers, including us, because we're equally clueless, we bring to you STEMPeers Global Conference 2021 with the theme Paths Less Taken. We will be discussing challenges one might face when transitioning into careers beyond the traditional tenure track positions. We'll be talking about issues STEM scholars face and also acknowledging and celebrating the fact that every person's journey is unique in its own way. We're kicking off this year's conference with the keynote address that will be moderated by Mansi Agrawal. Mansi here is a PhD candidate at Kent State University studying developmental neuroscience. Before starting, I would request all our viewers to drop in their questions in the comments section. And now over to you, Mansi.
Thank you, Nikita. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to STEMPeers Global Conference 2021. To start with, I would say as scientists, we know that scientific evidence is based on research facts, right? So over the years, science and technology have started playing a bigger role in making informed decisions and supporting government efforts to manage risks and uncertainty. Science not just offers solutions to problems, but can also help in evaluating the outcomes of a particular policy. It's a loop. So STEM knowledge influences the science policy-making process, and these policies then drive the future science and technology revolutions. These policies are important for innovations and for creating new employments that are tailored to expertise in that particular field. So having said that, our keynote speaker today is a perfect combination of a scientist, advocate, and a mentor who loves advocating for better opportunities for trainees and is passionate about bringing about a change from within the system. It is my honor and absolute privilege to introduce Dr. Adriana Bankston. Dr. Bankston earned her PhD in biochemistry, cell and developmental biology from Emory University, following which she did her postdoc where she realized her passion for developing new programs and reforms. Dr. Bankston is a principal legislative analyst at the University of California Office of Federal Governmental Relations in Washington, D.C., where she serves as an advocate for the university with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. Prior to this position, Adriana was a policy and advocacy fellow at the Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including the Society's annual lobby event and the annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, Dr. Bankston is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Publisher of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, an internationally recognized nonprofit organization and peer-reviewed publication dedicated to empowering early career scientists, engineers, and policy professionals in international science policy debate. She is also a biomedical workforce and policy research investigator at the STEM Advocacy Institute, as well as a member of the Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy Coalition Steering Committee. Without further delay, I shall now welcome Dr. Adriana Bankston. Dr. Bankston, thank you so much for joining us today. It is our pleasure to have you here with us. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, you can take it over.
Let's see, share my screen. All right. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're watching from. And thank you for inviting me to give this keynote speech to frame the STEMPeers conference. It's really an honor to be here with you all today. And as you heard in the introduction, I'm a principal legislative analyst at the University of California and also the CEO and managing publisher for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. So as we go through the presentation, I encourage you to tweet and tag me at Adriana Bankston, as well as JSPG at SciPol Journal, and we can amplify your tweets. So before I start, I just have to mention that this presentation is my personal view and not the views of my employer. Okay, so I thought it would be good to start with a big picture question of how science and society work together. And so here are a few models from a talk given by Kenny Gibbs a few years ago. And these are a few broad ideas. So one is that science and society are independent. They're overlapping with distinctions. They shape each other. So model 3, science frames and shapes society, or model 4, society frames and shapes science. And so you could think of this model in a number of ways, and probably some of each of these is true. And there's some overlap and some separation between science and society, but they're very integrated. So I'm not here to really convince you of one model or another, but this is something to keep in mind as we progress in the talk in terms of overlapping between science and society, but also distinctions between the two. I would say that I would favor probably model 3 and 4, which you may be thinking. And this also points to the interconnectedness between science and society. And really, this is actually a bidirectional relationship in which science shapes society and society shapes science. So going back to today's topic, so let's ask this question: where does the STEM workforce fit in here? And what does that mean to develop the STEM workforce of the future? So keeping in mind that one thing is the way we train scientists should fit this framework of training people in science who can use their talents in society, but they're also impacted by it. So I would urge us to think about the following questions. Number one is, how do we define workforce development in the context of this presentation and this conference? What does it mean to be a scientist today who is influencing society and going beyond the lab? Thinking through what it means to be a successful scientist, I would say successful scientists are good citizens. Thinking from your standpoint of, if you're doing research in the lab, how does your science impact society? And how do you take your science into societal impact? The bottom line, I think I would say that the workforce of the future connects science and society, but is also at the intersection of these concepts, as you can see on this diagram. And again, science and society influence each other, as shown here in a bidirectional fashion as well. And again, the workforce fits in here, and we'll elaborate more on this as we move forward. So what does it mean to train the workforce to impact society? So in my world, it means mostly graduate students and postdocs, but of course, this is only a subset of the broad STEM workforce. And there are many pathways for scientists at this career stage to influence society with their PhD. So this is a graphic made by Jessica Polka from ASCB a few years ago, and it shows career paths that you can take with the biology PhD. So you can see here that out of 86,000 US biology PhD students that year, only about 15% obtain tenure-track faculty jobs, and most others have non-academic careers. So this really points to the fact that we need to train graduate students and postdocs for a different world than we would have a few years ago, and also most of them not going into academia leads you to think about what training should look like. Of course, the pandemic is another factor that influences career trajectories as well. But when you talk about the workforce, I think beyond this graph here, there is also the outlook on jobs, which isn't portrayed here. But again, thinking about in terms of alignment between education, training, and jobs, and how training and workforce development align in terms of preparation for jobs. So I will tell you a little bit about my personal story to illustrate some of these points that we'll go through today. So as you'll see in my story, I transitioned from the bench into policy. And one point I want to make here is that science policy, which is the world I'm in now, is a bridge between science and society. And so this means that training graduate students and postdocs in STEM for science policy is actually a way for them to bridge this gap and to impact society. So on the one hand, there are sort of two fundamental concepts here. On the one hand, we need to teach trainees how to use their scientific knowledge to develop evidence-based policies, which will impact decision-making in governments. And this is what you would call science for policy. On the other hand, we also need changes within universities that can integrate scientific training and policy development, and thinking through how do we change the scientific system through policymaking to better serve the next generation. And so this is what you would call policy for science, in terms of how do we improve the scientific environment through policy change. And this can either be within the university or from the outside, taking into account additional stakeholders that includes funding agencies, legislators on the Hill, and so on. And so these are two fundamental concepts in policymaking. And I think the workforce, is really at the intersection of these concepts, as trainees themselves can influence policymaking with their science, as well as create policies that impact the scientific system, which will ultimately benefit them as well. So I want to delve a little bit more into this concept of science policy and how we can use this to make an impact. So according to the book Beyond Sputnik, national science policy is defined as the set of federal rules, regulations, methods, practices, guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. So you might wonder, why would I want to get involved in science policy? So I think that it provides an exposure to different ways of thinking and really expands your understanding of the world in a broader sense. It also provides an opportunity to address important societal problems and to make a difference on an issue that you're really interested in. You'll see this as we progress through my career path. It also gives the opportunity for a bigger picture impact on a larger scale on a specific issue, and the ability to use your science and the skills that you've developed in the lab to make an impact in society. Now, a lot of science policy is about impact. So this is something we do talk about a lot as far as what does that mean? How do you measure impact in policy? I think that also science policy highlights the idea of influencing the broader community. So you're not just sort of doing your research in the lab, what you're doing actually does have an impact in a broader sense. And what does that mean in terms of doing public engagement? And of course, being a scientist nowadays in the age of the pandemic has evolved and changed beyond just the lab research. So the pandemic, I think, has also shown us that it's important for scientists to engage with the public and policymakers. And this is a time where policy changes can really impact the scientific enterprise and also our future STEM workforce. So hopefully I've convinced you that science policy can be impactful. So now, how do we create the workforce of the future in this context? To answer this question, we need to understand a little more about the science to policy interface and how this has changed over time. So a lot of this is in the context of science for policy, or how scientific evidence influences society. And to give a bit of history, here, the ways in which science has engaged with government decision-making has evolved over the last 80 years. It does involve translating between different languages of scientists and policymakers and aligning information needs with outputs. And as you might imagine, of course, advice and expertise from scientists can influence decision-making that are made by policymakers, and formulating these views takes into account a number of factors, as we'll see. So how might you be able to influence policy? So again, some history. Before World War II, science was rarely in effective contact with policymaking and the political processes. Policymaking was actually understood, of course, as you might think of this, in pursuit of the common good to serve the public interest, and essentially in the best interest of the public, which the government serves. So this may occur through science advice mechanisms to governments or communications with the public. And however, while policymaking may be used, may be based on scientific evidence, it's not always clear how this knowledge enters the policymaking process and how the mechanisms actually influence policymaking. So it's a very dynamic field. takes into account many different types of inputs. And this is where the workforce comes in and their ability to influence this process and to contribute to influencing our national science policy priorities. So here is, again, looking at the big picture, what does it mean to influence policy? If you're thinking about this, understanding a little bit about how the system actually works. So in the context of the type of impact that you're thinking of making, what are the broad goals of this field? So policymaking as a whole involves consensus building and works by collective decision making, and also recognizing that communal actions can be better than individual ones to impact society. And I'll show you later what that means. As I said, it involves consensus building. This can be hard to do at times, but a lot of times it ends up being, again, communal action to influence legislators from a community. You do have limited resources and imperfect information. You just have to take what you have and make a decision. Sort of telling you this now because I want to talk about some of the impact that I've made in my career, but also to have you think about what kind of impact you can make on a specific topic. So, but I do want to highlight also that policymaking is complicated. Science policy is pluralistic in nature, supported by multiple agencies and overseen and funded by multiple congressional committees. So in this science policy web here from, again, Beyond Sputnik, at the center are key offices. So the White House offices, OSTP and OMB, as well as federal agencies, congressional committees and subcommittees, and also scientific interests that are represented by scientific societies, university associations, and non-governmental organizations like national academies. And the press, which is around this, connects these groups to certain peripheral groups. And these groups are universities, again, this is MySpace, industry, national labs, as well as scientific societies, state and local governments, and the general public, all of which have specific interests in science policy. So these groups are really at the center of the web, are the ones that are continuously influenced by interactions with those in the outer thread. So it's complicated, there's a lot going on, but also I think it provides a vision of how impact can be made, that if you're sort of able to influence one of these stakeholders, things sort of roll around through the web, and you can really make a big impact from being just in the system itself. So not to get too much into the weeds here, but because we're talking about science policy, so to give this background, policy is made in 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, and occurs through various mechanisms. As you can see this table here. Again, this is only to point out that this is a complex system, but again, you can imagine how it can be very impactful given the stakeholders involved and how these groups might work together. So moving on from this background, how might you then influence policymaking? So one good example is Vannevar Bush, who was a notable figure in this space. And he was an American engineer. Throughout his career, he emphasized the importance of scientific research to national security and economic well-being. And his text from 1945, Science, the Endless Frontier, was commissioned by President Franklin Roosevelt and called for a centralized approach for government-sponsored science. And actually, his proposal in this text led to the creation of the National Science Foundation in 1950. And so he was actually, in effect, the first ever presidential science advisor. And his quote, again, from the book, is that science can be effective only as a member of a team. Without scientific progress, no amount of achievement can occur to impact health, prosperity, and security. So again, thinking bigger picture about how science can impact society and the various inputs that can go into this. This is very high level in the way that we sort of think about policy in this space. So now going back to the workforce of the future, how does that fit in here? And what does that mean to prepare the workforce to be able to have this sort of impact? Again, I think specifically about graduate students and postdocs. although a lot of what I'm about to share really does extrapolate to other sectors of the workforce, not just grad students and postdocs. So the way I think about this is there are three key pillars that I want to emphasize today that I'll touch upon and illustrate with some personal stories. So I will mostly talk about policy for science for now, because I'm interested in improving the scientific system for the next generation and what that looks like. But part of that is also their impact on society. So the first is education and training. So how do we do this in universities? Who else is responsible for making sure that we're properly training the next generation to impact society and that they have the best possible environment? The second is empowerment. Empowerment of trainees to act on something that they care about. This is something I've done, as was alluded to in the introduction. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means to pass that on to others, to be able to feel empowered to act in policy. And finally, getting jobs and achieving a societal impact, again, because the education received will lead to job seeking. And of course, when I think about the workforce, this is very much about aligning training with workforce demands, and how the training mechanisms can actually prepare people for being successful in the workforce and in the job market. So I think, and this also fits under the umbrella of societal impact. So I will illustrate some of these points, thinking again through the kind of impact that you want to make and what I've sort of thought about throughout my career in this space. Okay, so now I'm going to take a step back and take you through my career path and how I've come to be interested in this topic, how I got to where I am today, and how I think about policy impact and how that fits into the process. So, and I will also share a few lessons along the way. So I got my bachelor's at Clemson in biological sciences, my PhD in biochemistry, cell biology from Emory. Did my postdoc at U of L, was quite set on an academic track. Here I'm showing you a press release that came out in 2017 on the last paper that I published as a postdoc. So you can get an idea of what I was working on, but also research was going pretty well. We were highlighted by the university by this paper that we published, and it was a high impact paper. So I was on a good track to be in academia if I wanted to. But at some point I realized that I wanted to do more. This goes back to the broader impacts question. How do I really see my future and my impact in society with my science? I sort of started thinking that there's probably something more than just a lab that I could do. However, I think one lesson from here, the first lesson is be curious. Be curious about where your science can take you. I went to U of L for a specific lab, and this is really where my journey started into where I am today. Being in Kentucky isn't the most exciting place in the world, but that actually I was able to use that experience to build on that and build experiences that got me to where I am today. So don't be afraid to take risks and experiment and see where things can take you based on your science. So during my postdoc, I was at a point, again, I was exploring my career path. I didn't really have a good idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that it wasn't academia. So as it happens, the postdoc office at U of L didn't really have resources for postdocs in terms of career options. And so I actually started this series, which is called CRAFT, Career Research Advancement Focused Training. It's basically a seminar series that brings speakers to talk to postdocs about careers. Of course, I learned about career options, it was useful for networking. And this really pointed to the fact that I really enjoyed putting together programs for postdocs and going the route of career development and training and developing workshops and trainings within the university was something that was evolving as a potential interest for my career. Then I took this a little farther to organize a ASCB funded research symposium, which again connected trainees from different universities in the Midwest together, created some community, And again, thinking broader impacts beyond just the university, then maybe I could impact more universities than just U of L by doing something like this. At the same time, due to the lack of resources for trainees, I became involved with the Postdoc committee, which is one of the few where postdocs actually have a voice in policymaking in institutions. I was one of the two postdocs on there, again, started to think more about how can I influence the system from the inside? Can I help trainees through policymaking within, again, changing university policy from the inside, and what does that mean? So it sort of planted a seed that I could impact trainees through changing policies within the institution. So I continued to follow this interest that I had in training and career development. I joined several organizations where I later became a leader in some committees with the National Postdoc Association and the Graduate Career Consortium. These have a lot of university administrators as members, and so I learned about how they think about training young scientists from their perspective. At the same time, policy was coming into focus a little bit as a potential way to help trainees. Again, Kentucky, there isn't much there to do as far as policy goes. But I got involved with the Kentucky Academy of Sciences, and we actually developed an award for societal impact of science through the academy, which they still have today. And that was really a good way to gain experience in education, policy, and advocacy, and start to think about impact beyond the university into the community that you could have with your science. So the message here, what I would say is follow your passion, because although I didn't know at this point really anything what I wanted to do, I knew that it was something related to trainees, helping them transition, giving them training. And I really pursued this interest in training and education, really just to see where it would lead, and did a lot of activities in this space outside of the lab. So one of these, moving on now to the empowerment piece, how did I actually take this interest into action? So it happened that when I left my postdoc, this nonprofit called Future of Research was starting up. They advocate for trainees. If you haven't heard of them, check them out, futureofresearch.org. So I got involved with them as a volunteer, and they happened to have a project on postdoc salaries, which again was very motivating. I had just left my postdoc and really still wanted to help trainees somehow. So in 2016, there was a federal labor law mandating that postdoc salaries would increase across institutions in the US. And so they were doing a study looking at compliance of institutions with this law. So we ended up publishing a paper. The data that I'm showing here is at a particular time point prior to the implementation of this law in terms of what institutions were planning to do. And we ended up using these data to push for policy changes, and we're able to actually get a few universities to increase salaries, which is really impactful to be able to see that change. We later did more research on postdoc salaries. It really just became an interesting research project, but we also wanted to increase transparency around postdoc pay in universities. And it was very successful. I think it was sort of my claim to fame, if I can say that. We ended up giving talks at universities about these data. We were highlighted in Nature and so on. So it really became, I think, something that put Future Research on the map as well as a group that was looking at this topic. In addition to data analysis, we also organized events, local meetings and symposia, again, where early career researchers could talk about academic issues like mentoring and career development. And that was, again, successful. We published that in a few papers, again, to get the voices and the issues of young people out there in terms of what they were saying about academia in an aggregate format, and sort of, there were national meetings. It was a good portrayal of what this looked like nationally from trainees, and again, very useful data. So I think, and also these summaries again became a good way for Future Research to make a name for itself as a nonprofit. And again, we really were able to increase transparency around some issues in academia. So this was an example of advocacy from within and also bottom up. So grassroots advocacy bottom up. A lot of us were trainees who were either in academia or had left, and we're trying to make a change from bottom up. And this was really the start of my path into the policy route, because this was the first time that I had connected academia with federal policy, right, with this law. That I experienced really for the first time that actually policy might be a way for me to impact trainees, and sort of started pivoting to this direction, thinking, how can I then use policy to impact more institutions? So what I can say is, with these projects, with future research, I think that, this was the moment when I knew that I found my purpose, that my career was going to be focusing on, and I wanted to spend my time around helping trainees. And because, I spent a lot of time on this project, I volunteered, there was a lot of data collection, but realizing that if it's something that you are doing in your free time, you're not getting paid to do it, and it's really a passion project, that's a good example of something that you might want to pursue because you're doing it naturally, and this is something that's where your interests are. So that was definitely something for me that I discovered this is something I really enjoy doing, and might want to follow this path because clearly it was something that I was really passionate about. So if I had a lesson here, I would say find your niche. Again, this is a niche topic for folks who are interested in, academic issues and grad students. There's a subset of folks who are interested in that, of course. And so finding the people who are in this space, who are interested in this, who want to help you move forward and are equally passionate about this topic is helpful and is a good way to move forward and think about how can I use this interest now to continue down this path. So now, because I had this interest in trainees and broader impacts, my interest in science policy was fairly nascent. I was looking for something that would combine all these ideas together. And again, how do I help trainees now through science policy? And so I joined the Journal of Science Policy and Governance in 2018 as a director of communications, did some social media, and then later switched to outreach. And now I've been the CEO since May of this year. And just to sidetrack a little bit and give you some background about why JSPG is so valuable and what it actually is, what we actually do. So JSPG is an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed publication. It is also a 501c3, and we publish peer-reviewed research on a wide variety of policy topics, but we also serve as a vehicle for students and early career scholars to publish articles concerning every corner of science and technology policy. We are an independent platform for them to bolster their research and writing skills in policy. And we encourage them to engage and contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government. And so this is, as an early career scientist, it can be very impactful to not only publish your ideas, but to take them to the next level and see how they can make an impact beyond the publication. Just to give you an example, so we do publish in a variety of formats. A few of the topics just to highlight that we publish on, for example, data science, engineering, health, innovation policy, international science diplomacy, climate change, STEM education and workforce, space policy, and so on. So these may be of interest to this crowd. And as I said, we do strive to elevate the publications at conferences and in media outlets, and really thinking about how can we be more than just a journal on the shelf or the digital shelf to help early career scholars put their ideas into action. So here's an example of a news piece that was published by Northwestern from a paper that Northwestern students published in a journal. It was nice to see this highlight on their page, which is a good example of policy impact. So in this set, I would say is pave your own way. At this time, the GSPG team, when I joined, we were growing. It was an opportunity to contribute my thoughts and ideas to the growth of the journal and the business itself, because it is a nonprofit. And to think about how did I want to use the journal to make an impact in policy. And also this extends to now being a CEO, because this is something I think, you take a risk, you take a position that you're not really ready for, but then you sort of figure out your way in it. And being something that I was really passionate about, you sort of take it on and then think about how you want to use it to make an impact. So this was certainly something that I didn't necessarily feel ready for, but I know that it's a good move, and enjoy what I'm doing now, and again, keep thinking about how to make an impact in this role. So I just want to share a couple of our latest successes, because we just published a standard issue this week, focused on various topics such as climate change, research policy, healthcare, etc. And this also celebrates 10 years since our first published issue in June 2011. So we made it more of a celebratory issue, and you can check that out on the link on the slide. And then in relation to the topic of education and workforce development, we currently have a call for papers out with a deadline in January. We held a series of panel discussions on this topic, and we also have a writing workshop later today on this. So this is also useful as we look to enhance professional development for early career scholars with these types of events. But I encourage you to also keep an eye out for our future events. And with this point, I would say that we are building the future workforce to use their science in society in this way. And again, my roles with JSPG and Future of Research, I think, are part of this goal, both on the academic side and more on the society side. How do we use this to impact society? So now I'll switch to my actual policy experience, which really started with JSPG. And then in 2019, I pursued a policy and advocacy fellowship with Society for Neuroscience, where I did a number of things. This was actually not very long ago. It seems that a lot has happened since that time, but this is how the field goes. Things move quickly, and as you'll see, there's a good opportunity to make an impact if you're involved in the right issues at the right time, in the sense. So in this fellowship, which you might be interested in, there's a lot of advocacy. So we worked on Capitol Hill Day, which they organize every year. That involved SFN members, including trainees. We represented SFN at coalition meetings, monitored legislation, and created a neuroscience champions checklist, which is essentially representatives that supported neuroscience research that we wanted to grow a relationship with. And so we maintained this database. Also help with training. So you can see here the Early Career Policy Ambassadors Program. This is a program that they have every year that brings trainees to the Hill and engages them in advocacy during the year as well. And this was really enjoyable, of course, kind of blending my training and policy interests together to be able to actually look at applications of this program and determine who would be coming to DC. Communication, obviously, this is a big part of policy as a whole. One thing I did work on writing professional testimony. So this is what the president of SFN would use to testify in Congress in support of NSF and NIH funding for neuroscience. Crafted responses to the NIH request for information. Again, this is a common thing, but it was the first time I had done it then. In relation to the BRAIN initiative, and then wrote different sections of the Advocacy Network newsletter, which informs SFN members of federal advocacy and policy items that are relevant to them on a monthly basis. Again, these are common things that you do in this space, but this was the first time I had done them. So I think at this point, I was quite new to policy and advocacy. I took on this challenge and pivoted completely from the bench into policy with this fellowship. So I think, if this is something you're interested in, I would say, take the challenge, do something new that you've never done, because you never know where it will take you. And this is how you can impact research, neuroscience research in this case. So it's a good way to impact actually a specific field in science. And again, how you might be able to actually impact society through policy change. This fellowship certainly served that purpose, and it was the beginning for me in that sense. So now going to my current position. So in 2019, I took an even greater challenge, I think, in my current job. And I really couldn't fathom at the time how impactful this could be. So in my role at UC, we advocate for the priorities of the university with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. So advocacy is very central to this position. So I also work on, as my title says, legislative analysis, looking at policies that impact university research. We also organize a number of events over the past couple of years, such as Capitol Hill visits and briefings. Again, we bring UC researchers to DC to talk about the research that they do and then advocate for funding using that. So below in this picture, you can see an example of an event that I organized, which is Advocacy Days for CNSF, which is the Coalition for National Science Funding. This was organized for Hill staff to attend and for UC researchers to talk about, in particular, how the pandemic impacted our early career researchers. So we had graduate students, postdocs, and early career faculty. It was a nice variety of perspectives. And we find that early career perspectives really resonate well with Hill staff as well. And of course, it's very enjoyable to include trainees in this day. And it was very focused on how NSF funding can help the next generation and how the support is necessary for the future workforce. So I think I would say that this position has challenged me in a number of ways, I think very good ways, to expand what I really thought I could do and into much more. Obviously, it's clear that being at UC is a way to impact institutions and for our university's interest to be heard on the Hill. This includes, we also answer campus questions, for example, on federal research opportunities. We're really sort of the federal arm for them for these questions. And this is where I feel like making an impact is really possible from this sort of role. And I think, really thinking through here, how can you make your mark on the world from your current position, right? So UC does have a certain position. As I said, my fellowship was in 2019, so it's not that long ago, and yet I feel like, I was able to make an impact here that I'm really proud of. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of what that looks like. One thing I'm really excited about is I organized this briefing on the impact of the pandemic on early career researchers, where we had graduate students and postdocs participate who talked about their research and how the pandemic impacted them. And this turned out to be a really powerful message for Hill staff, again, to hear from students and how the next generation is impacted and why we need more funding and why we need to try and get research back up and running. Another thing I did was contribute to this RFI from the NSF. In 2020, they were looking for input into their strategic plan from 2022 to 2026 from the community. So one of the things, I alluded to this in the beginning, in higher education and policy, there's a lot of community advocacy. So this was an example of actually the Association of American Universities was gathering information from stakeholders, and they submitted a response to NSF on behalf of a number of groups coming from AAU. And so I contributed to this section that is outlined here on racial equity and diversifying the STEM workforce, which again was very exciting to be a part of this project with AAU and have a section in there. So I think, to be honest, I still feel quite new to the government relations space, although I feel, I've been here for 2 years. The main thing to emphasize here is that, you can really make an impact, honestly, much more than I thought I would be able to make just from the slide. And I think hopefully this is just the start, pointing out again how I sort of blended my interests with policy and early career researchers into this position. And that's a good example of something you can do to really spotlight trainees and their needs and the needs of the workforce on Capitol Hill staff, with Capitol Hill staff, and also with agencies like NSF. So this is, I think, a good example of an impact of federal policy through briefings and these sort of responses to RFIs. So what I want to impart here is that, as an early career researcher, you can make an impact, and so don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Through my own advocacy, I've also realized how important it is to emphasize this point to the next generation. And so this is another lesson to take away from this. And again, you can really make an impact in this sort of role. And the last thing, which again, I'm really excited to share this. I've learned how to write legislation over the last year, which is interesting. Again, I'm very interested in NSF-related issues because they fund basic research, but also they have a lot of programs in training and workforce development. And so earlier this year, you probably heard about the NSF for the Future Act, which proposed a number of changes to the NSF. And one of the sections focused on training, mentoring, and professional development for graduate students and postdocs. So great fit to try and make an impact here. So we wrote some language for including mentoring in the bill, and notably this amendment, which you can see here, that we wrote, provided professional development funding for postdocs, in addition to graduate students, which was already there. So postdocs were added, and again, we made a number of other edits to this section. And just so I wanted just to share this so you can see what the language looks like in the amendment. But this was really exciting in terms of this amendment was actually offered on behalf of Representative Zoe Lofgren by Chairwoman of the House Science and Technology Committee, Eddie Bernice Johnson. And this legislative impact, I think, can be very powerful in that, of course, it's a big bill, there's a lot of money in it. And then the fact that they included this training section was really important. And also, again, the amendment actually passed by voice with unanimous consent and was adopted during the full committee markup. And the bill passed the House in June 2021, which is an accomplishment in this space. I think what you would consider this is one way to make an impact, that you actually are getting your language in the bill. And I think, again, this sort of impact isn't something that I really thought possible, when I took this job. So it's something that, I knew that I wanted to impact trainees. I knew legislation could be a way to do it. I obviously didn't know this was an option. Especially for someone like me, who is still fairly early in government relations, but was really exciting to be able to do this at this point. And of course, as you've seen, this is something I'm really passionate about and really excited to be able to make this impact, which is, different from my previous work in research and sort of bottom up. This is very much sort of top down, saying, NSF needs to create programs to help trainees and so on. So bottom up and top down seems like I've done both. But this is really exciting accomplishment this year. So to conclude, going back to this question, to build the workforce of the future, we need to focus on these three areas. Again, this is sort of my view of the future: education and training, empowerment, jobs and societal impact, and policy, of course, is cross-cutting across all these areas because it impacts all three. But also, we need to also train the workforce to be successful in policy. So as I've shown you, policy is a way to impact society, but also a way to impact trainees themselves on these issues. And thinking through again, how do we improve the environment for trainees while they're doing their research? And I think it's also a continuum to where there is a common thread throughout these three areas, from science to society, and really the empowerment, I think, being central to this this concept of empowering the workforce to actually act on these topics. And more broadly, if you think about this as a concept, how can you apply this sort of framework to an issue that you want to change in society, right? So I think it's a good framework to think more broadly beyond just impacting science. So here are all the takeaways from today. Be curious, follow your passion, find your niche, pave your own way, take the challenge, make your mark. As an early career researcher, you can make an impact, and the path less taken is often the best way to make a mark. And this is something, going back to the slide, which I didn't mention it here, but this is sort of where I feel like this legislation impact was an example of that, and the way to actually make a mark on something that isn't that common. It doesn't happen that commonly. And so I think, and I wanted to, share this image at the end, because I think it's a little bit hazy as to where things go. The path is not always clear, but it could lead you to unexpected places where, you can really find a way to make an impact and to define what that impact means to you. So at the end of the day, this is my story. Think about what your story is, how you want to tell it, what kind of impact you want to make, how you want to build your career and your future, keeping these points in mind. So hopefully this provides a good framing from my perspective of the intersection of science and society, and how science policy and workforce development intersect, and how you can make your mark in this field. So I wish you a very successful conference. And I also wanted to share my LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'd be happy to connect further. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bankston. That was an amazing talk. Like, oh my God, the entire process, your career journey is so inspiring and so much to learn from. Not just like, as a grad student myself, I am still trying to figure out what I want to do. And then just to think about the fact that while navigating your own career, you are also able to help other people find, resources and gather resources for them. That's amazing. And actually, I'm going to start my first question with that. So how difficult or easy was it to bring together these resources for other trainees while you were navigating your own career? I mean, besides the adrenaline rush and the passion for bringing in those reforms, what do you think were the challenges or the obstacles that you found in your way?
Yeah, so actually, the first thing that I developed was really this program at U of L, the craft series. The motivation there was that there was really a gap, right? So, they really didn't have training for postdocs. That is one way to think about this. If there's something that you need, there's a resource that you need that doesn't exist, you can probably create it at the university, because you already have the framework and some programs already exist, probably. I think the challenge was trying to balance, having a full-time job in research and doing all these other things. And then, at one point saying, okay, this is really where my career is going and I need to drop something, right? To really focus on the next direction and put all my energy into that. So I think, yeah, like you said, passion is probably enough for me to do something and really get into it 100%. But there is this kind of navigating the different things in your life at a given point, and thinking, maybe, especially if you want to change direction from research, you do still have to keep your job while you're doing this. But at some point you have to say, I don't think this is where I'm going, and I may just drop this and focus on something else, right? So you are building your path in the meantime while you're still keeping your job, right? So there's that is a challenge. But I think a lot of this comes back to, I think, mentoring and advisors who are supportive, and PIs that can you can talk to and say, like, I don't think I want to go into academia, how can you help? And that's partly how this started. I mean, for me, I actually ended up getting a second mentor who was sort of my policy, sort of higher education mentor, because my advisor didn't know a lot about this topic. So, that's a good way to do it, and get advice from other people who are either have more knowledge or who have gone through the transition themselves, and then you can kind of ask them how they navigated it too. That's another good way to go.
Thank you.
Again, that was a really great talk. I mean, I had no clue about what science policy is, but I think I know something now about it. So, so we have two questions on YouTube. But before that, I would like to ask a question. So, like you said, you found your niche in while doing postdoc, right? But there are some people, I think, including me, like who think that before starting your PhD program, you think now that's your concrete path, like you have to follow this. And then when you feel trapped, you feel lost after that. Like, I don't know what to do after this. So, what are your thoughts on, like, is it too late to start? By this, I mean the fear that if I transition now to a different career, will, like, be it related to my field or not, like, will it take me too long to reach where I want to be? Like, what do you think? Like, what would you say about that?
I don't think it's too late. I think it does take a while to build your portfolio. I think it probably took me 2 or 3 years to build kind of a solid policy portfolio, different experiences that I had to be able to then apply for the fellowship and be competitive. So it does take a little time. But also, I think policy is a very dynamic field to where, so one thing is, people come into the field at all kinds of, different ages, different career stages. People do fellowships later in their career and they go back to academia. So there's a lot of options to where, if you want to just explore policy and then, go back to the lab, that's an option. So yeah, I think, being open-minded that these things can be done. You just have to, I would say, number one, take some time to build the kind of your CV. If you don't, if you know that you want to leave academia, think about what you want to build. It will take a while to gain those experiences. Have a good list of things in your CV you can point to. But also it is very dynamic and flexible. People come and go and move around, different sectors and come into policy, later, earlier, later. There's all sorts of options. So there's a lot of opportunities.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question on YouTube. It says, what is the best way to measure impact on a large scale of policy at federal level? Example, impact of pandemic on STEM research.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I think well, I guess I'll point to one thing that I mentioned. One type of impact is this legislative language, which we spent a lot of time writing this language and trying to get it in the bill. So that is in itself is an accomplishment to be able to get something included and voted on. Gets in the bill, and so now the NSF, does have to create a program because it's a law, right? Or it will be. So I think impact. That is one. The other sort of, what I described is a lot of these kind of advocacy events where you actually interact with Hill staff. It's hard to know kind of down the road what that is, but you'll see, here and there things happening. Like we did see more of a focus of legislators on early career researchers. There was actually a Early Career Researcher Act, I think it's called, which came out because of the pandemic and their impact of the pandemic on ECRs, which didn't exist and may not have even happened if there wasn't from the pandemic. So you do see these impacts in legislation, and the fact that staff were very receptive to coming to this CNSF day or briefing, and they want to hear from students, and so you can kind of see in different ways that this is having an impact. I think, and it's interesting on the other way too, that students talked about the impact of NSF funding on their future, and a lot of them were first generation. They said, I almost quit grad school, but because I got this grant, I stayed in grad school and finished school. So you can see the impact of federal funding also on their research and their future. So yeah, there's a number of ways to look at this, I think, depending on the topic, but you do see different things happening based on your advocacy.
Thank you.
So just trying to build up on Nikita's previous question about early career researchers, so who are still trying to, find out what they want to pursue as a career and what they want to try out, like when they want to try out different avenues. How easy is it to get internship opportunities, especially for international students or postdocs? And what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, that is a good question. So because unfortunately a lot of these fellowships, you have to be a US citizen to apply. There are some that you don't have to be. I think Merzion, some societies have other ones that you don't have restrictions for citizenship. I would say, the best way to gain policy experience is to do this sort of volunteering, because most of what I had done, for 2-3 years was, with different nonprofits. I gained different skills and did, organize things and had different experiences here and there. So you don't have to, and of course, like when I applied for the SFN fellowship, that does require citizenship, but, I do think that you can get into policy without that. If you build up sort of your portfolio and, volunteering with different organizations that are working on things that are interesting to you is a good way to do it. And that doesn't require anything, right? But yeah, and then, looking at some fellowships that are not restrictive for citizens, again, there's different ways to get into the field. I mean, I think there's fewer opportunities for international students, and that's something we're actually trying to work on one of these projects that I have. But I would say, if you're really interested in policy, find some groups that are working on policy and get involved with that. But you can still get into the field even if you're not a citizen.
So the second question on YouTube that we have is, what are the main challenges in making legislation amendments? Is it a purely data-driven process, or are there other socio-political concerns?
I think there's a lot of factors. I'm honestly still learning about how the whole process works, and there's a lot of political background about, who knows each other. I think also competing priorities. I mean, you can imagine legislators have so many priorities that they deal with every day, and which ones will they focus on, which is probably partly where the most money is. But, it's sort of this question of early career researchers, I think, has come to the forefront with the pandemic, and more legislators now are working on this, right? So it's also a question of, well, maybe if, my colleague is working on this, maybe I need to do something in this area, right? So, it does end up being a common thing. So yeah, it's the whole, and I didn't talk too much about this, the way that the whole legislative process works is a whole other, I could spend an hour talking about that whole process. Very complicated, and there's a lot of factors, some of which are political, other ones are, other interests and different folks involved in these things. So yeah, it's a complicated process.
Yes, thank you.
So we are short on time, and I am going to take one final question, which would be like a concluding remark, I think, given your insightful talk. So a lot of immigrant scientists, they look towards non-policy related careers once they decide to look beyond academia for career growth. How can we make science policy careers more attractive for early career researchers from the non-US countries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll reiterate what I said, that, there are ways to get into the field. I know that these fellowships can be restrictive, and that is still the easiest way to get in, is if you get a fellowship, that's kind of your way in. I mean, my general advice for ECRs who are interested in policy is to find an issue that you care about, and then find somebody who works on that and get involved with them, volunteer, organize events, write blog posts. I didn't talk about this, but, through the journal, and I encourage people to write anything that's not academic, like blogs are a good thing to do and kind of get your mind thinking that way. Internships are an option. A lot of nonprofits have opportunities, I think, more for internationals than a university might have, or government definitely is more restrictive. But there are also internships on the Hill. So there are ways to find these opportunities if you look around in different sectors. And as I said, I didn't say this, but a lot of people that transitioned from the bench are very happy to talk to people, and I'm happy to talk one-on-one if people are interested and have more questions. I do a lot of this sort of informal mentoring for students who want to transition into policy, and having gone through it. But a lot of people who have transitioned actually are happy to talk to you. So I would also talk to other people in the field.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Adriana Bankston. We are so happy and so glad you joined us today. It is our pleasure, and we learned so much. Definitely taking home messages, be curious, take the challenges, follow your passion, and pave your own way is something that we all need to do. It's just hard given the current, given the restricted environment we are in within the lab. But then, we all have to work towards that, I guess. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to request our viewers, or tell our viewers, that our first session for the global conference is coming up soon. It starts at 11:30 ET. That is in about 20 minutes from now. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much once again. It was nice talking to you, Dr. Bankston.
Thank you so much.